Thank you. I'll just share my screen. There we go. Can everybody see that? Okay.
Definitely. Looks great.
Thank you so much for the kind words, both Dr. Frederiking and Dr. Pekoski. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak during these really challenging times, and we're all on Zoom and getting used to this. This is a topic I'm really passionate about, and throughout this next half an hour or so, I'm going to basically tell a story of some of the research that I've been doing to help answer the question posed in the title here. So the objectives of my presentation are to provide a social epidemiological framework to assess disparities in adverse birth outcomes and why study adverse birth outcomes. Why is that so important? I also want to examine predictors of birth outcomes using some of my current research that I've been working on, both past and present, and a little bit of our future research. So to begin this story, I'm going to show you the person to the right is someone who means a lot to me. He was my PhD advisor, Dr. Bill Avison, who is now retired. He was a sociologist from Western University, and the paper to the left came out quite some time ago, 2012, and I actually worked on this paper during my graduate work before completing my PhD. So I took a course with Bill, and we had to write a review paper for the course. And one thing that I was so passionate about, a lot of this attributable to him, was the impact of socioeconomic status and cumulative disadvantages across the life course, and what this means in terms of implications for health outcomes. And the real message here, while I don't want to sound deterministic, is that social inequality sometimes can follow people over time. So people who are born into disadvantage, it becomes more difficult for them throughout the life course to get out of that. And my research hopefully will provide points of intervention where we can improve children's lives. But if you look at this picture, it's a bit of an ouch, but in many cases it does occur. The idea that this is yours and it's been passed in the family through generations. We see on the right a picture of poverty, and we see on the left a picture of riches. Now, I don't want to again sound deterministic, because we always know about some people who came from extreme poverty that are now very wealthy. But the probabilistic nature of social science research says that that's not that easy. So for a lot of us, we cluster throughout different stages of the life cycle into greater disparity. And actually what happens is the disparities can become more paramount throughout the life course. And this can have implications on health outcomes, including even things like premature death. So one really key element of the life course perspective is the idea of long-term temporal patterns. And really the argument is to understand the present, we really have to understand the past, and sometimes even the distant past. So who we are today is very much shaped by our past. We're not determined by it, but a lot of who we are comes from what's happened before, which speaks to the importance of longitudinal research and not always just looking at research at a given point in time. We also know that health disparities in adulthood, whether that's coronary heart disease, hypertension, cancer, a lot of these can be linked to early life exposures. But again, we don't want to sound like you're set and it's a deterministic path. There are trajectories that can occur that set us onto different pathways, if you would. Because the reality is that health outcomes in adulthood are products of complex interactions of cultural, historical, demographic, and genetic influences. I'll speak a bit more about that in a few slides. Another element of the life course perspective is the idea of linked lives. Linked lives basically means that if something happens to me, it's going to affect people who are close to me. If someone close to you in your family, something happens to them, or they go down a wrong path, or they get sick or whatever, it's going to affect other people in their close linked network. If we relate this back to the idea of pregnancy and birth outcomes, we know that untreated prenatal depression is associated with offspring child mental health problems. And that includes both externalizing and internalizing problems. Externalizing mental health problems would be things like aggression or antisocial behavior. And those mental health problems tend to, on average, be more linked to males. Whereas internalizing mental health problems could include things like sadness, low self-esteem or fear, and for the most part, they tend to be more common among females. But again, what does this tell us? It tells us that we need to focus on screening for mental health problems during pregnancy, because there is a clear association between prenatal depression and offspring mental health. Ali Smith, who is one of my former graduate students, and she's on this call, this Zoom meeting. Her and Dr. Tweinstra and I published a study that came out this year, which also showed a link with adolescent psychiatric disorders between untreated prenatal depression and depression and anxiety in adulthood. And last, environmental stressors can also interact with personal genetic vulnerabilities to produce differences in health outcomes. So what does that mean? Well, that means, for example, if one has a genetic, say, vulnerability to something like alcoholism, well, clearly the person who has more genetic vulnerability has a higher risk than someone who doesn't. But interact that with an environmental situation where you have a genetic vulnerability to alcoholism, and unfortunately, a child is in a very is in a family that has a lot of poverty. Maybe there's more substance use, child neglect. The odds of alcoholism are way higher than if someone just has a genetic vulnerability alone. So that's what's meant by a gene-environment interaction. And another really important element of the life course perspective is that of human agency. Human agency is basically the idea that we have the ability to make choices in life. And while that is absolutely true and it's undeniable, the reality is that the choices we make are not that easy. They're very much patterned or limited by different factors such as socioeconomic status that can limit the extent to which we can activate the human agency. So again, if we come from a family living in poverty, these choices are not as easy as those that come from more advantaged neighborhoods, or advantaged families rather. The other really interesting piece with respect to socioeconomic status and health disparities overall is the fact that someone is living in poverty or that have low education. That doesn't automatically mean they have poor health outcomes. There has to be something that kind of meshes that relationship. And statistically, we call those mediating factors. And in the literature, there's two common reasons why there's such a strong relationship between socioeconomic status and health disparities. The first is that by and large, people who are more economically disadvantaged and who have lower levels of education have greater exposure to stress. And that includes different kinds of stress as well. Now, for those that are on this Zoom call and are university students, they're saying, oh, what about me? Of course, we have different stages in life that become very, very stressful, studying for exams, etc. But when we compare that to those who have low levels of education and low income, there's a much greater difference. And people, for example, who are economically disadvantaged, examples of stressors could be poor living conditions, low job security, not knowing if the job is stable, financial difficulties. Do I have enough money to pay the rent at the end of the month? And the other key piece besides stressors is that research consistently shows people from low socioeconomic status backgrounds engage in more risky health behaviors. And that is the case during pregnancy as well. So we generally find that low-income pregnant women are more likely to smoke cigarettes during pregnancy. They're more likely to use cannabis and abuse different substances, and they tend to have poor mental health. And that's linked with the stress. But one of the problems with the whole argument that I made is that it almost blames the victim. So if you look at this model here, it's pretty straightforward. We have socioeconomic status, which in turn influences stress, which in turn influences health. And we have the same at the bottom, but we have risk-taking as the mediating factor. And that could be cannabis, diet, physical activity, etc. The problem with this approach, even though grants continue to focus on stuff like this during pregnancy, is that we're almost blaming the victim. The idea, if low-income women would just be less vulnerable to stress, if they would stop smoking cigarettes, if they would stop drinking alcohol, if they would exercise more, if they would eat better, but that's a lot of finger pointing. And the big problem with the finger pointing with respect to women is that it completely neglects their socioeconomic background. And by the way, I'm casting a wide net with socioeconomic status. Race and ethnicity would also be a fundamental cause of health disparities, as would gender, or as would beneficial social connections. And I should also say that when we talk about genetic vulnerability, there's very little research to support that some people are more vulnerable to stress than others. It's usually exposure to stress that's more common among people from disadvantaged backgrounds. So what does this mean in terms of policy? Well, I would argue that less focus should be put on behavioral change, stop doing this and stop doing this and stop doing this, and more should focus on targeting social inequality with respect to policy. I'll even make a statement. This is kind of a bold statement, but I know the World Health Organization says that diet quality, we've got a lot of people in nutrition here, diet quality and physical activity are the two fundamental causes of health disparities. Okay, this is me. I completely disagree, because diet and physical activity is patterned by socioeconomic status. So when I read research that says food price is the #1 determinant of food choice among people who are economically disadvantaged, we can't say diet quality is the fundamental cause, because people make choices based on the price of foods. And this brings me to something called the theory of fundamental social causes. Bruce Link and Joe Fallon wrote, in my opinion, one of the best papers in the history of sociology, medical sociology, in 1995. And basically the theory was that factors like socioeconomic status are the true fundamental causes of health disparities. It's not diet, it's not physical activity, it's not smoking cigarettes, it's patterns of inequality which then lead to different exposure, like diet or substance use. And the interesting argument they make is that when these risk factors change over time, the differential exposure still persists by people of different groups of socioeconomic status. So where am I going with this? Well, even if we look at things like when bad things happen, such as the Titanic, most of us have seen the movie. It is the low-income people that died first. Why? Because the people that were high income were the first to get on the boats. When we think of the World Trade Center at 9/11, interestingly, it was people with less prestigious jobs who are more likely to be in rooms without windows, and they were the ones who are more likely to die. When we think of environmental conditions like Hurricane Katrina, it was poor areas that were flooded first. From a geographical perspective, this is interesting. Why? They had the highest risk of flooding. And when good things happen, such as the discovery of smoking causing lung cancer, what we generally find it is people who have higher levels of education who take advantage of that information. And they were the ones who were the most likely by far to quit tobacco smoking. When knowledge about health benefits of a low-fat diet came out in the mid-20th century, for the most part, it was people with higher education and higher income who took advantage of that information and moved away from a low-fat diet. It was those that took advantage of that information and used that. Even things like cancer screens, for the most part, we find that people who have higher levels of education are more likely to be screened for cancer. All of this is linked to what we call cumulative disadvantage theory. The idea that social disadvantage in early life can accumulate throughout the life course, leading to further exacerbations in health disparities. And an important concept of cumulative disadvantage is the idea of exposure clustering. So this is just one example. We know that children from low socioeconomic status are more likely to be born low birth weight for a variety of reasons, which I'll get into. They tend to have poorer diets during their childhood. They're more likely to be exposed to secondhand smoke. Why? Because mom and or dad are more likely to smoke cigarettes among low-income families. And they have less opportunity to pursue post-secondary education. So if we look at this little diagram at the bottom, we see a clustering effect where we have adverse childhood experiences leading to a greater risk, again, not deterministic, but a greater risk of social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which then can increase the risk of adoption of healthy risk behaviors, smoking cigarettes, abusing alcohol, etc., which increases the likelihood of disease, disability, and social problems, and ultimately to premature death. So how do I link all these social epidemiological theories with my research interest, which is what we call DOHAD, Developmental Origins of Health and Disease? Before I came to Brescia in 2014, I worked as the Department of Pediatrics and Children's Health Research Institute biostatistician. And our former chair, Dr. Guido Filler, gave a really interesting presentation on what was called the Barker hypothesis. This is really fascinating. Basically, David Barker was a British epidemiologist, and in 1990, he proposed that babies who were born with preterm birth, I'm going to give the abbreviations here, low birth weight, intrauterine growth restriction, and small for gestational age, basically small babies, they have a much higher risk of developing coronary heart disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and mental health conditions like depression in adulthood. In fact, Time magazine came out with a front page that said how the first 9 months shape the rest of your life. And as a sociologist, this is fascinating to me because we're always taught to look at things long-term, kind of like I said earlier. But this is talking about specific critical stages in one's life that can potentially have long-term health implications for baby. And basically the way the Barker hypothesis works is what's called fetal growth programming. It's the idea that if the fetus is not well nourished in utero, it can program itself to deliver more nutrients to the brain rather than other organs of the body. So if we look at the little diagram here, we have under and or overnutrition, so early life nutritional insults, which then leads to epigenetic changes and subsequently to things like metabolic disorders such as diabetes or obesity. But as a statistician, I also know that correlation does not mean causal relationships. It can, but it doesn't have to. So a correlation between a baby being born small and adult disease doesn't necessarily mean it's causal. And in fact, preterm birth, low birth weight, intrauterine growth restriction, small gestational age are actually factors that are influenced by socioeconomic status. So if you look at this model here, it's kind of complex, but basically if we look at preterm birth, low birth weight, a lot of these birth outcomes, we see the linkage like David Barker proposed to coronary heart disease, obesity, etc. But again, we also know that these birth outcomes are shaped by parental socioeconomic status and by diet quality and SES in adulthood, etc. So the point is that while the Barker hypothesis, I know Paul Barker is on this, it's not the Paul Barker hypothesis. Hi, Paul. The Barker hypothesis may be a biophysiological process. It's also likely a pattern by social structure, in this case, socioeconomic status. Again, one of the things that we have to avoid, though, is the idea of mother blame. It's the idea that moms during pregnancy are causal agents in this reproduction of adult disease. We see all the fingers pointing towards mom here. That actually causal factors are somehow maternal, quote, choices. And that moms can be either harmers or helpers for their kids. I love this quote from an article that makes this argument. It was Dr. June Matthews that told me about this article, and I loved it. Just a review paper, but they said, a frame about behavior that rests solely on the individual and avoids broader context is generally easier to communicate than one that draws connections to external forces. And I couldn't agree more. In 2016, Emily Campbell, who was a former MSc-FN student, she's an RD, worked on a paper with me, and this was kind of like a review paper to get ready for the bigger paper. And basically I said, I want to know everything we know about socioeconomic status and adverse birth outcomes. And basically what her review found was that education, income, even the neighborhood that you are raised in and live in for most of your life, and occupation can all have an impact on birth outcomes. And Emily was a very, very successful, she actually got 5 peer-reviewed publications out of her master's, which is just outstanding. Once Emily published that, we then did our big quantitative paper. And this was published in 2018. We looked at just over 26,000 births from Southwestern Ontario. We got the neonatal and perinatal databases from London Health Sciences Centre. And I wanted to see if, in fact, socioeconomic status and adverse birth outcomes, if that relationship is strong as one would typically see in the US. Because in the US, there's a lot of evidence for it. And one of my close colleagues and close friends, Dr. Jason Gilliland, who's also on this, Dr. Gilliland helped me out. Basically, we got all this data on medical history, on socio-demographic profiles, on risk-taking behavior of pregnant women, again, just over 26,000, but we also collected postal code. And what the HEAL lab did, Human Environments Analysis Laboratory, with the help of Dr. Gilliland, is we geographically mapped all pregnant women to their home neighborhood and where they're living to get factors like neighborhood level income, neighborhood level education, what percent are recent immigrants, what percent are visible minorities, etc. And interestingly enough, we found that socioeconomic status actually had very little impact on low birth weight and preterm birth. And it's kind of what we thought. We thought the relationship would be smaller than what we see in the US, contrasting healthcare systems, differences in social inequality, etc. But one really interesting piece that came out of this is that we found that pregnant women who self-reported using cannabis during pregnancy had almost a 3-fold increase in having a low birth weight baby than pregnant women who did not use cannabis. And more importantly, we were able to statistically adjust for tobacco smoking. So studies that show relationships between cannabis and birth outcomes without adjusting for tobacco use, I'm not too convinced about, because we already know tobacco is highly associated with poor birth outcomes. But we were able to adjust for that. And it was the largest study to date at that time in Canada to show that relationship. And I was pretty excited about it because it got a lot of media attention, CTV News. It was named the top medical discovery of 2017 at Lawson Health Research Institute, which I was happy about. The reason why 2017, it was published in 2018, so it hit the media a little early. And I know nothing about BuzzFeed on Snapchat, but my oldest daughter, Morgan, calls me and says, "Dad, you're on BuzzFeed on Snapchat." And I don't know what that means. Now I do, but apparently it got a lot of views. So the next step is we went a step further. We looked at the relationship between alcohol outlet accessibility and adverse birth outcomes. So what we essentially did is we looked at all LCBO outlets across all Southwestern Ontario for all 26,000 pregnant women. We looked at all the beer outlets, and basically we looked at bars wherever you could consume alcohol. We looked at proximity and density surrounding every single pregnant woman, geographically mapped. This was really interesting. Basically, what we know is that alcohol outlet accessibility, the greater the proximity you have to alcohol outlets, the more likely you are to drink. Now, that might not surprise you, but we don't know a lot about alcohol consumption and proximity for pregnant women. And in fact, this also was the first study done in the country to look at this relationship. And basically what we found was two important things. One, greater proximity and density of alcohol outlets surrounding pregnant women's homes led to greater alcohol consumption. And although it did not translate to birth outcomes per se, the other unfortunate thing, or fortunate because we want to get the information out, is that alcohol outlets tend to be clustered in more disadvantaged areas across all Southwestern Ontario. And again, this is problematic because we know that we know there's a relationship between social disadvantage and substance use. But while we know of LCBO outlets everywhere, they do tend to, with beer outlets and bars, tend to be more clustered in areas of disadvantage. So then one of my former graduate students, he's back a graduate student with me again, doing his PhD with myself and Dr. Gilliland, Nick Woods, did a systematic review looking at the influence of the built environment on adverse birth outcomes. We want to know, what are these built environment factors beyond just alcohol outlet accessibility? And he found things like greenness, power plants, gas stations, waste management, power lines. But the number one factor studied in the literature was roadways. And basically, Nick found that 12 of 17 studies, that's just over 70%, found a significant small to moderate association between high traffic exposure and adverse birth outcomes. So then, again, with the help of the HEAL lab, which I'm part of, and Dr. Gilliland, Dr. Gilliland says to me, you know what we have to do? We have to take this review paper and translate this into something we can do quantitatively. So we used Nick Woods' review paper, systematic review, to actually do this in practice. And the second author, Alexandra Smith, this was also part of her master's program here in Foods and Nutrition. So she got a really good publication out of this in a really high impact journal called Environmental Research. And basically the purpose of this was to go a step further. So we know that substance use matters. We know that in a lot of the literature, socioeconomic status matters, though less so in Southwestern Ontario. What about the impact of the environment? So the objective was to test the relative influence of environmental, demographic, medical, behavioral, and neighborhood socioeconomic status factors associated with low birth weight and preterm birth. And to give you an idea for what we looked at for environment, we looked at sulfur dioxide exposure, ground level ozone, fine particulates, distance from every pregnant woman, again, 26,000 roughly, to highways and major roads, to gas stations, power lines, industrial land use, even distance to grocery stores, variety stores, and parks. Now, this was really, really interesting because what we found was sulfur dioxide exposure across all Southwestern Ontario was highly associated with poor birth outcomes. And I should say this too, that when we look at pollution and birth outcomes, the relationship is all over the map. So a lot of the studies are done in very geographically distinct areas like Tokyo, like Los Angeles, like Detroit, areas where we know that there is a high level of air pollution. But this is the first study that was done in Southwestern Ontario. We want to see what was going on. And if you look at the odds ratio here of 3.4, this basically means that for every 1 unit increase in sulfur dioxide exposure that pregnant women were exposed to around their homes, we used a 3-year running average, you were 3.4 times more likely to have a low birth weight baby across all Southwestern Ontario. That's huge. Now, when we went to publish this, one of the reviewers made a good point, and they said, okay, well, a 1 unit increase in sulfur dioxide would be a very large unit increase in pollution. So they suggested doing a small incremental increase. So what we would call an interquartile range increase. That's basically an increase in pollution that would be relatively common across Southwestern Ontario. And when I did that, the statistics don't change, nothing changes other than the scaling factor. We found that a interquartile range increase in exposure to sulfur dioxide was associated with a 30% increase in low birth weight. The p-value, by the way, would never change, just the odds ratio would in the confidence interval because of the lower scaling factor. And then other variables that were positively correlated with low birth weight would be things like underweight pre-pregnancy BMI, previous preterm birth, marijuana use, tobacco use. Then we looked at preterm birth. By the way, I should say that most would argue preterm birth is a much better outcome than low birth weight. Low birth weight is a little bit outdated because most babies born preterm are low birth weight. But low birth weight and preterm birth tend to be the two most common adverse birth outcomes continuing to be studied in the literature. So what did we find? Again, a very strong relationship, double. So for every unit increase in sulfur dioxide exposure, you were 2 times more likely to have a premature birth. And when we scaled that back, so a small incremental interquartile range increase, that translated to a 20% greater likelihood of having a preterm birth, or 1.2 times more likely. It means the same. After adjusting for all other variables in our model. So what does this mean? It means that these results suggest that pollutants can travel from the lungs of a pregnant woman to the placenta. Some of our more recent work that we're doing, we just published this in 2020. This is another graduate student of mine, former graduate student, Stephanie Wong, and she was the first authored co-author on this paper. Dr. Twinstra and Dr. Gilliland is on this. Dr. Jocelyn Cook, she is with the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada. And this is interesting. This looked at risk factors and birth outcomes specific to teens. And we found that over 4% of all pregnancies at London Health Sciences between 2009 and 2014 were teen pregnancies. And interestingly enough, teen pregnancies tend to be associated with coming from neighborhoods of greater socioeconomic disadvantage. Again, going back to my very earliest slides, that clustering effect. They had much greater mental health problems, significantly and practically very important differences in substance use during pregnancy than adult mothers. However, once we statistically adjusted for these factors, it was largely unrelated to poor birth outcomes here in Southwestern Ontario. And Ali Smith, who's on this with Dr. Toinstra, we also published a review paper that finally came out. This was done a long time ago, but came out 2020, and it was in press for a long time, looking at the impact of antenatal depression and offspring health outcomes. And we found that antenatal depression is associated with preterm birth, excessive infant crying, and offspring mental health problems. Going back to the argument that untreated antenatal depression or prenatal depression is strongly associated with adverse effects on the infant nervous system. So this basically tells me, going back to the concept of linked lives and life course. So dealing with mental health screening very early on in pregnancy, or ideally even pre-pregnancy, is so important. So that concludes my presentation. I want to thank Brescia for giving me this opportunity, Lawson Health Research Institute, I'm a scientist with them, for providing the data, Children's Health Foundation, Children's Health Research Institute, Schulich, and of course, I can't say enough about HEAL and all the great work that they've helped me with. And I'm open for any questions.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for your insight, your enthusiasm. I think you've given us a lot to consider, a lot to think about, and a lot to reflect on. So all gratitude to you from Brescia. I can see that there are some applause markers in our Zoom meeting. So that's wonderful. The gratitude is wonderful. We are open for a Q&A session. So Jamie has opened it up to questions. If anyone has them, you can raise your hand. You can put them in the chat box and I will moderate. And we can individually unmute and you can ask them. Jamie, I'm interested in where to go from here, right? I mentioned that you've given us a lot to think about, but where are you going with your research and your interests?
There's so many different ways we can go from here. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is the effects of the legalization of cannabis here in Canada. So given that I found a really strong relationship between prenatal cannabis use and birth outcomes, that was pre-legalization. And what we generally find with substance use is as growing social acceptance goes up, so does use. So we even know that, and it's kind of scary, but I will say that cannabis use has been linked to psychosis, psychotic episodes, especially with more frequency of use and the THC content. So I'm particularly interested in, if cannabis use goes up during pregnancy, what effect is this going to have both on mom and on baby?
Absolutely, that's really interesting. Are you going ahead with that at this point?
It's totally on my radar.
I know that there are a lot of things on your radar, so that's interesting to hear. Thank you for that. I'll just pause for a second to see if anybody pops up.
Amy, Saverio Stranges here. First of all, congratulations, fantastic lecture, and congratulations on your work throughout your career. I'm very impressed. And quality training you provide also to the students as well. So I'm completely aligned with your message that, health behaviors, including diet, physical activity, smoking, addiction, sleep, are driven by social roots and social determinants of health. And you show some differences, for example, between Canada and US in terms of, social gradient driving these health behaviors. So I was wondering whether, another line of research you will consider will be the potential impact of different welfare systems in a kind of, international framework, because obviously the potential impact of social determinants do vary based also on the, if you like, structure of the welfare system across countries. So I was wondering whether, you will have any comment or interest in looking also at this specific issue.
Thanks so much, Savario. It was a great question. I haven't looked too much into that, but I'm very, very interested. I read something, I want to say about 3 years ago, that was done in Alberta, where they gave income supplements to pregnant women. When I say, I can't remember what it was per month, 100, 120, but to help them out. And it very interestingly, preterm birth plummeted. And then the program stopped. So I would argue with respect to, welfare and income, governmental policies that target the right thing are going to have greater population level health than stop doing this and stop doing this and start doing this and start doing this. I think it's a great question, Severio. It's something I'm interested in and would like to pursue further.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Roberta Baginski.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. Hi, Dr. Seabrook. Thank you so much for this lecture. It blew my mind with all your results. I've been reading your papers, but it's much, much better to actually hear from you instead of reading from you or from your results. So congratulations again. But I actually need to ask you, I'm an exercise physiologist, and in my mind, exercise and physical activity is the cure for all the diseases in the world. And I truly believe that. I'm a true believer and a researcher that thinks if everybody exercises, then the world is much, much better. Of course, that's my bias. But then I'm thinking now with your lecture, Canada is making a huge effort and spending so much money creating guidelines, movement guidelines, physical activity guidelines for pregnant women. Last week, we had the launch of the 24-hour movement guideline for adults. But now I'm looking your lecture and thinking, is it the answer? Like, are we educating pregnant women? They should move, they should eat well, but with all the SES disqualities and like differences, what should we do? How should we work together? Like the exercise and diet people working together with the politicians and working together with like to make new policies and how to help those women more. I need to hear from you. How should we work together? I'm not sure if this is a good question or not, but I need to hear from you.
That's a great question, Roberta, and thank you so much for your kind words. We definitely have to collaborate. So here's what I say. I always say that the best research, in my opinion, are those that are able to take advantage of multidisciplinary team experts. So I completely agree, exercise is absolute paramount for physical health and mental health. Can't say enough about it, right? But I also know that, people like I've mentioned many times, Dr. Jason Gillan has had a really good impact on me with respect to geography. So as sociologists, we tend to do our research very, Canada, US, keep it North America type thing, but for the most part. But people in food and nutrition want to say, you are what you eat. And Dr. Gilliland has helped me understand you are where you live. So when you think about physical activity, it's much easier. You think about yourself or anyone else that's on the Zoom call. to want to go out and to do physical exercise if you live in areas of greater green space. There's access to parks, recreation areas, sidewalks where you have a place to go, trees. Those are the places that I want to be. And green spaces also tends to be more clustered with areas of advantage. So to go back to your question, I would say, yeah, let's take that physical activity. Let's take that diet quality. Let's work with geographers. Let's work with public health experts. Let's work with people like Dr. Severio Stranges, who has a background in epidemiology, and take advantage of each other's expertise so that we can really put together a fresh set of ideas that encompasses all the different multifactorial factors that are really associated with poor birth outcomes in pregnancy.
Fantastic, thank you for that. I think we're going to take our last question from Dr. Heather Kirk.
Jamie, thanks for your presentation. Obviously, I'm asking this as a layperson, a complete neophyte to sociology. But what stood out to me is that if these are generational disparities or inherited almost determinants, how effective are immediate or contemporary interventions? Is there, I don't know, I'm just not trying to say, is there a point? Because obviously there's an ethical or moral reason to intervene to assure a better equality in the social determinants. But I'm just wondering, how much do you have to change to really to benefit these differences?
It's such an amazing question, Heather, and I would go back to that initial model that I showed about when mediators change, the fundamental disparities persist. Different mediators come in. So I can't tell you how many times I have analyzed statistically studies that have looked at things like BMI for those who, pediatric obesity, and what do you find? You put them on specific drug or certain diet quality, and BMI goes down, and then it goes down, and then it stabilizes, then it goes right back up again. And the reason is, in my opinion, is it's still behavior modification, and that is extremely hard. So we will see studies that are published that I think are really important. I don't want to downplay them. It's just that if we want to see population level health change, in my opinion, we must address the fundamental causes of health disparities, differences in gender inequality, differences in socioeconomic status, differences based on race and ethnicity, these types of things.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that we have reached the end of our hour, and with that, Dr. Kirk is our next speaker. So she asked the last question in the first presentation, and she will begin on November 27th at 11. And lots of applause for you, Jamie. Again, to revisit where we're at Brescia University College, I think we're uniquely poised to build those interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary energies. And we care for each other as a community of scholars. But I think importantly, the next decade is going to be filled with lots of writing together, lots of thinking through questions together, and your presentation invites that for us. So thank you. I'm going to add my applause and thank Dr. Pekoski. Did you have any additional thoughts, Jen, before we say goodbye?
Only gratitude again for Jamie and for all of the attendees for joining us and taking part. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.